Hi, Dr. Lou Pulsfer here. I'm not going to say anything that's particularly new in this screencast. I just thought it would be a good idea to compile the 10 things you most need to know about game design. This is for aspiring designers. If you're a pro, you likely know these things already. Also, it's not about the business of game design, it's not about marketing, it's not about publishing, it's about designing games. That is to say, creating gameplay that entertains or informs. 10 is a purely arbitrary number. In fact, I've already started another screencast for another 10. I've tried to pick the 10 most important here. So here's a list, and I'm just going to let that go by so that we can start talking about each one individually. Number 1, you are most unlikely to get rich. You might hear of independently wealthy game designers, but they are quite rare. Most game designers don't make a living any more than most novelists, playwrights, painters, sculptors, filmmakers, or composers make a living. Typically, people have a day job, a second job. In tabletop games especially, there's not much money. Now, Reiner Knizia makes over $1 million a year, but he is the exception, the big exception. Typically, tabletop game designers don't make a lot of money, very little. Video games involve a lot more money, and there are a lot of people who work for video game studios who are making a living. But there are a lot more game designers than there are people working for those studios. And there are thousands of games published, so the average designer makes very little. To go back to tabletop, you may think of the mass market, the kinds of games that are published by Hasbro. But that's beyond your reach. It's beyond almost everybody's reach. The competition there is fierce. So you're not likely to have a game published as a mass market game, although it happens. There's a game called Blokus, a mass market game. The Frenchman who designed that game, as far as I know, has never had another game published, but he is independently wealthy because of that game. So it does happen. It's just most unlikely that you're going to get rich. You're more likely to win a lottery, get a big lottery payout, than you are to get rich designing games. Ideas are mostly worthless. Some wag said, ideas are like blankety blank holes. Everybody's got one. And in fact, what you think is a great idea almost certainly isn't. It's likely been thought of 100 times or more. Moreover, ideas don't sell. Games sell. Nobody wants to buy your idea. They want to buy a game. And finally, no one wants to make your game for you. They want to make their own games. Most game players think they have ideas for good games, but most of those ideas are not good, and in any case, few of those people ever complete a game design. And it's complete games that you sell, not ideas. Especially if money is involved, game design is sometimes unappealing work. It is not about playing games. In fact, you will probably play fewer games if you're a game designer. Playing games is actually quite unproductive. Even for a game designer, you may play games to be familiar with what's going on, but you're not getting your own games designed while you're playing somebody else's games. Also, you may enjoy playing games less because you'll see the innards. You'll see how the game is made. You'll sort of deconstruct it in your mind. And for some people, that reduces the pleasure of playing the game. And finally, there are just things you have to do, detail things usually, bugs, or gluing together boards or cards. Whether you're a video game designer or a tabletop game designer, sometimes some things are just plain tedious. Innovation is highly overrated. There's a very, very old saying, there is nothing new under the sun. I think that's in the Bible. There's very little that's new anyway. It takes a long time for new things to come in, even now. Surprise is important in games. And if you do something in a game like use a particular mechanic the players aren't familiar with, you might surprise them. But most mechanics, although they may be new to you, are ones that somebody else has thought of and probably used in a game already, even if you don't know it. Now here's the example I usually use. You may have heard of the game Stratego. It used to be very popular. And some people would say, oh, that's an innovation. In fact, it's an almost exact copy of a much older game called, and my French pronunciation isn't there, L'Attaque from 1909. A Dutchman, after World War II, added a few little things, a column and a few more pieces to L'Attaque, called it Stratego, sold it to a Dutch company who licensed it to an American company, and so forth. Stratego never caught on in England because an English company had published L'Attaque and several other games like it. And so there wasn't really room for Stratego. So what seemed like an innovation to some people and in some countries was in fact really old, an old hat in others. Where new comes into play in games is in the combination of mechanics and settings you use. And here's a quotation that sort of puts this all together. The idea is like your finger. We all have them. But the implementation is like your fingerprint. Everyone's is unique. It's the implementations that game companies want to buy, not the idea. Don't worry about someone stealing your ideas. It's most unlikely to happen. It's a small industry. Even video games is a small industry. If somebody steals something, the word gets around. And as I've already tried to point out, game ideas aren't worth much on their own anyway. And everyone seems to think they have good ones, so why steal somebody else's? Also, parallel development happens. That is to say, two separate individuals or groups have the same ideas and develop games that appear to be quite similar, even though they were developed entirely independently. That definitely happens. It's not a matter of, oh, somebody else uses this idea, so they must have stolen it from me. No. More likely they thought of it on their own. Now what we do have in video games is lots of clones, which are deliberate copies of successful games. But those are games that have been released. Those are games that have been published. So what I'm saying is don't worry about people stealing your ideas while you're developing your game. If you aren't willing to talk to anybody about your ideas, how can anybody know whether you're worth talking to? Games are not stories. Games are activities. Traditional stories, novels, plays, films, are passive. Very different. And in fact, most traditional arts, like composition, for the person consuming it, it is passive. You sit and listen to music. So games have to be play tested in a way that these other kinds of arts do not. Now what typically happens is aspiring designers want to design a game and they think of stories instead of games. I used to teach video game design to college students and it happened all the time. I'd ask them to write up ideas for games and they'd write up ideas for stories. Well, stories help sell games, but games consist of mechanics. What people do. And there are actually thousands of games that have no story. Yes, every game has a narrative, that is to say, an account of what happens. But many games do not have stories that are meant to entertain with various standard elements like characters and plot and so on. Many people who design RPGs and video games nowadays want an experience. They think more in terms of an experience than a game. And I think oftentimes they are actually frustrated story writers. but they still have to do it through the mechanics of a game. If you don't know what mechanics your game is going to use, you don't have a game. Maybe you have a story. The most important question you can ask yourself is, who is my target audience? Game design is always about constraints and compromises. And the first set of constraints comes from your intended audience. No game can appeal to everyone, so you have to choose who you're going to appeal to. And then you have to understand that audience. And you have to test your game with that audience. You have to recognize that that audience has various things they don't like or do like, and those are constraints on how you design your game. It's inevitable. And in fact, you are better off designing with constraints. Constraints lead to creativity. It's much easier to design something when you have constraints than when somebody just says, design something, and gives you no limitations. So ask yourself, who is my target audience? The second most important question is, what is the player going to do? And I emphasize do. Games are activities. Players of video games especially have been conditioned to expect to be doing something more or less constantly. Visualize in your mind, as you're developing the ideas for your game and the concept, what is the player going to do? Imagine you're that player and what you're going to do. Is that enjoyable? Does it fit with your target audience? If you can't say yes to both those questions, why is it in your game? Get rid of anything that doesn't contribute to the player enjoying what he or she is doing in the game. And this is why playtesting is sovereign. You cannot be a good judge of the quality of your game. You have to rely on representative members of your target audience. They play the game, you watch, or perhaps they play it somewhere else. They give you feedback, you modify the game accordingly until the feedback you get is, yes, this is a really good game. The longest chapter in my book, Game Design, is about playtesting, because playtesting is the heart of game design. The playtesters can't design the game for you, but they can tell you whether they like it, whether it's good. Here's number 10. Your goal is to complete games. No professional, no publisher, no funding person is impressed with a partially completed game. You've got to prove that you can complete a game the same way a novelist has to prove that they can complete a novel. Matt Forbeck, who has written many novels and ran a game company for quite a while, tabletop game company, and has designed many tabletop games, wanted to write a novel for some company he was working for, and until he could lay in front of them a novel that he had finished, they didn't want to talk to him. But once he had done that, then they started to give him writing assignments. And as I said, he's written a dozen novels at least since then. But he had to prove he could do it. The most common advice I have seen for aspiring designers is, you must make complete games. Now, all of these ideas are discussed at greater length in one or another of my courses, usually in Learning Game Design, which is the big one. And as I said, there will be 10 more in another screencast sometime in the future.